Our first speaker is Koven Smith. Koven is Director of Digital Adaptation at the Blanton Museum of Art, where his focus is on the adoption of digital values across the museum. Prior to that, he was Director of Technology at the Denver Art Museum, Manager of Interpretive Technology at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Systems Architect at the Indianapolis Museum of Art.
Not all at the same time.
Not all at the same time, but if you know an interesting thing about that list, if you know anything about things going on in the digital world, that is the kind of the big list. And Koven's been involved in a lot of really interesting institutional efforts. Koven has served as co-principal investigator on the Horizon Report Museum Edition, as well as adjunct faculty in the Arts Administration program at New York University and the Museum Study program at Johns Hopkins University. From 2010 to 2013, Koven served on the board of directors and was the conference co-chair of the Museum Computing Network. Koven?
I'm going to try and keep Twitter open, so if anybody, if you home viewers have questions or anybody in the audience, please let me know. So, okay. So today, actually, I want to kind of zero in on the part of digital interpretation that we sort of don't give as much thought to as we probably should, which is actually the word digital itself. And I want to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about that word, digital, at the Blanton Museum, and how that's actually playing out in my position and what we're doing there. So the first question I usually get when I tell people my weird title is, well, what is a director of digital adaptation? Like, what does that mean? And what exactly does that person do that's different from like a chief digital officer or a chief technology officer? And what that means is actually tied into very directly into the kind of museum that the Blanton is. So very, very brief, quick history. So the Blanton Museum of Art began on the University of Texas campus in Austin. In the mid to late 60s as the University Art Gallery. It is only within the last few years actually turned into a full-fledged museum with its own building. So it's changed from the University Art Gallery to the Blanton Museum of Art only in 2007. So it's a very new museum. The director there is also very new. She's been there for about 3 years, and most of the senior staff, including the curators, are all relatively recent hires. So it's an extremely young and very new museum without a whole lot of the kind of legacy or baggage that one tends to associate with, with art museums in particular. So in thinking about And the Blanton Museum has always outsourced all of its IT to the University of Texas. So when the director of the museum approached me about possibly doing some sort of digital work with them, we had to address exactly what form that would take. And so the fact that the Blanton is a new museum, that the staff is young in terms of tenure, not necessarily always young in terms of age, but that the team is very small, so that there was a possibility for the kind of agility that you don't normally see at a lot of larger museums. The museum already had a really good history of strong social media efforts. So even though the museum is not known necessarily for its digital properties, for its website or blog or content like that, they had really significant success with the kind of social media efforts that really required you to be really creative about how you use social media rather than just simply something that required a lot of money or a lot of resources to do. And then also at the Blanton, largely due to its size and the nature of the staff that's been hired, there was a very cross-disciplinary approach, which meant that there's very little of the usual sort of siloing that you see in museums. And I know that's a word that we kind of overuse, but it's definitely something that I saw as a positive and gave us a chance to really think about how we were going to do this in a different way. So what we really came to an understanding, the director and I, was that the fundamental problem that we needed to solve is the same problem that almost all museums have with technology, which is the integration problem. What do we mean by that? The issue with integration of digital/technology into museums has been one that has largely been handled thus far by building a department that handles all of those efforts. And as a result, digital efforts have not necessarily been integrated into the wider staff competencies at most museums. Like most digital efforts are kind of all self-contained within that digital or technology department, which creates a pretty significant production bottleneck, because instead of, like for instance, in an art museum's case, a curator conceiving of, creating, and then producing his or her own content, it has to go through a really strange production workflow that involves it going into a digital media black box before it comes back out again. And so, that was something that we saw when I first got to the Blanton. Right now we have one person who posts all of our blog entries, which means that there's this very long, kind of complicated editorial process, which really limits our ability to respond in real time to things that are happening out there in the world, because our production process is weeks behind what's actually happening. We knew we didn't want to build a digital media department. And again, partially that was because we wanted digital and digital media to feel like something that everyone in the museum had ownership over. Rather than what you typically tend to see at a lot of institutions. Sorry, I'm talking about like this fantasy of typical museums, and so maybe that's slightly offensive, sorry. But we wanted to make sure that digital wasn't thought of as something that that department handles. That, I don't need to know how to send tweets because we have a department that does that. We have a chief digital officer that knows how to do that. And we knew that wasn't the approach. And we also wanted to avoid what I call the iPads on railings problem, which is this very sort of tacked-on approach to technology where effectively, like I can think, in past museums that I've worked at, often you would do the walkthrough with the curator talking about what the interpretation for a particular exhibition was going to be, and then you would reach that point where the curator would say, and this is the railing I want to have the iPad on. Rarely discussing exactly what the aims were of that, what we wanted to do, whether that was even the correct modality for disseminating that information or not. So this is something that I try and keep in mind is, when we conceive of new technology projects, I'm like, is this an iPad on a railing? Is this something that we're just tacking on at the end because it feels like a digital thing that we're supposed to have, as opposed to something that's tightly integrated and potentially transformational to the entire process? So this is maybe my favorite quote. This is from Koven from subtraction.com. He was talking about the New York Times innovation report. This was a review that he had. But this very much kind of defines the approach to digital that we wanted to take at the Blanton Museum of Art, which is to say, we didn't feel that we, just by virtue of being a museum, that we should be congratulated for having digital efforts of any kind, but that we wanted those digital efforts to be meaningful and important apart from any legacy that we might have as a museum. And I think that's a really important lesson for our community to understand, because I think we still tend to expect that the value that we've accumulated over decades, if not a century and a half in some cases, that value will automatically translate to the web or to other digital properties. And we don't necessarily know that that's true. So this brings us to digital adaptation. And what that means is that in thinking of all these things together, what we really wanted to do at the Blanton, how we wanted to approach it, it seemed clear that we weren't really talking about building, we certainly weren't talking about building a digital team or a technology team, but really what we were talking about was building a process. And this was a process by which the museum could kind of go from being what it was to what it's going to be. As I say, bringing us boldly into the first couple years of the 21st century at least. And so adaptation is something that right now is basically designed to last a short period. We're going through an adaptation process that we're expecting to last about 3 years. And while it may seem silly to say at the end of 3 years, we'll walk out of there and say, okay, we're digitally adapted now. In effect, that's what we're trying to do. And at that point, the hope is that the museum will be significantly transformed and able to work a little better in the 21st century, a little more natively. And so the word digital adaptation actually came, or the term actually came from this book, and now I've forgotten the name, and now I can't read, Paul Boag, sorry. We were trying to figure out what we were calling this process, and we were thinking digital transformation, but that didn't feel right. And then we saw this book from Paul Boag, who is at Smashing Magazine, called Digital Adaptation, and it was so clear. It's like, oh, yes, that's right. That's what we're doing. And so what digital adaptation means for us fundamentally is actually thinking of digital in terms of values rather than in terms of technology or platforms. And how that plays out is, oh, whoops, sorry, I gave that away. So when we think about digital values, what we first had to address was really what we meant by digital itself and how we were going to address that at the museum. And so actually about this time last year, I think I posed a question to my Twitter followers. I said, you know, for those of you who do quote unquote digital in museums, like, how do you define digital? Like, what is that? Like, what is digital and what's not digital? And it was interesting that for all these people who sort of live with this every day, and in most cases, many of us actually had digital in our job titles, none of us could come up with a good definition for what it meant. Like, we knew that we needed a definition of digital that was more expansive than just online or just technology. But we still couldn't come up with something that really made sense. So in doing research, it came across a report that the UK digital agency, My Society, did for the UK Parliament, where they were assessing Parliament's digital presence. And there was this wonderful nugget of text here, which is, digital is shorthand for we accept the internet values of usability, needs focus, and agility. And sorry, and that's My Society. And look, there's a picture of Parliament. Thanks for the 3 of you that got that joke. But why this is important and why this works is that it allows us to address digital not just as a set of technologies or as a set of platforms or as this app or as that website, but it's something that we could address across the institution where, in fact, we could even apply it to things that we might traditionally think of as non-digital efforts, you know, in-person programming or exhibition content. But so what this means is that it also means that we can basically assess both our sort of technology-based and non-technology-based efforts with the same set of criteria. And I'll go through each one of these 3. So in talking about implementing these 3 digital values, the way this plays out, the first is usability, creating usable products, which obviously sounds more simple than you would think. And something that museums historically are not great at doing. I'll go into a little bit more depth on this. But also focusing on real need. So not putting things out there just because we have them or because we seem to think that they're valuable, but actually addressing things in terms of real expressed needs from users and visitors. And then maybe the most important is structuring for agility, making sure that we can pivot quickly, that we can address changes in technology, in cultural mores, all sorts of things quickly and work in an agile way. So when we talk about creating usable products, one of the biggest things that we need to address at the Blanton and in museums in general is eliminating skeuomorphs and anti-patterns. So skeuomorphs, that's a term that may be familiar to some of you. It's probably unfamiliar to a lot of you. We were hearing that a lot recently during the design changeover at Apple. The more recent versions of iOS have eliminated what they called skeuomorphism. And so what skeuomorphism is it's basically where you take something from the analog or the physical world and translate that almost directly one-to-one into a digital interface. So like for instance, when it used to be that on the iPhone, when you would fire up your calculator app, that the buttons were designed to look like real buttons that you would push, or that you would have interfaces where there were sort of virtual dials that you had to try and turn with a mouse, and it was really complicated. But what skeuomorphs were designed to do is basically take an unfamiliar digital interface and help to make it familiar for the user. And over time, what happens is, as the user becomes more familiar with the digital interface, the need for that physical referent is no longer there. But when those things stay and stick around, then they start to become what we call anti-patterns, which is a design pattern that no longer actually helps, but actually can actively harm the user experience. So I was thinking about when Jonathan was talking yesterday about how his students at Parsons didn't know what a file was anymore. And so that's an example of a skeuomorph that came very much from the physical world, where you had literal folders and literal files, pieces of paper that went into those folders. We translated those into our digital interfaces because it made it easier for us to work. But now you have a whole generation of people that have probably never actually handled a file folder or a piece of paper, and therefore that is now starting to become an anti-pattern. It's something that's actually harder to understand rather than easier. And so most of museums' digital approach on the web has been largely skeuomorphic in nature. So you think about the way that we put our collection online, or that we have a virtual exhibition online, or we have our event online. These are things that work in the physical world and that we've just translated directly into our online properties, without really understanding if that's the most optimal way to present that material. And so this is the thing that when we think about usability for our digital properties at the Blanton, this is very much something that we're working to get rid of. So the second part of our definition of digital is focusing on real need. And this is one that's hard for us. The tendency in museums is for us to say, we have X amount of real estate and I want to fill it with knowledge that we have. That's true both in the physical space and the digital space. I mean, and I've certainly sat in on plenty of website redesign meetings where it's basically like, well, I need to have a page, and that page will have all of my development material on it, or it will have my essay on X, or it will have whatever. As opposed to looking at it from the perspective of the user and saying, well, what is it that the user needs to do? What is the thing that needs to happen here? And then addressing it from that standpoint. And what that sometimes means is that things that we want to put out there, we won't put out there because our users don't actually need those things. And we'll see how this plays out in real life, but that's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. And then the last part is structuring for agility. So for us, this means increasing our competency with digital and technology tools amongst all staff. And we're actually getting ready to adopt something that the Getty started doing a while back called 10-minute tech. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with 10-minute tech. But it's this sort of wonderful thing where they meet in one corner of the I've never been to the Getty, which is strange. I guess there's a Getty lunchroom, or whatever the Getty equivalent of it, but they meet in one corner of the lunchroom and basically will address just one very small piece of kind of technology learning. And they do this every week. And so it might be something as simple as how to use Control F to find text on a website, or how to use the open with command on your Mac. Things that we sort of take for granted, but that a lot of staff don't know and are afraid to ask. And so we're getting ready to do that at the Blanton as well, but also doing things like, for instance, making sure that anyone who is writing a blog post has an account on our blog and can actually post the post themselves and knows how to do that and knows how to format a link. All these things that basically cut down the amount of time that it takes us to get something out into the marketplace of ideas. So how is this all working out in practice, you may ask? or maybe you were asking, I don't know, but that's what the slide says. So I'm going to talk about, I should mention here that I've only been at the Blanton since mid to the end of November. And because we're on a university campus, we take almost the entire month of December off. So I don't know what that works out to, but just a handful of months. So in that time, here's a few of the things that we've done. The first is witness voices, which, and I'm sorry, this screenshot is horrible, but if you go to witnessvoices.blantonmuseum.org, you can see the site yourself. But Witness Voices was, or is, a site that was created to go along with an exhibition that we're currently showing at the museum called Witness, Art of the Civil Rights Era. And this is a show that actually began at the Brooklyn Museum, is now traveling to, or has now traveled to Austin, Texas. And Witness Voices was something where we had to think early on about what we imagined the user need to be. So we felt that, sort of your traditional exhibition website wasn't really what needed to happen. So there were two things. We knew that there was a lot of historical context around the artworks in this show. These are all, artworks roughly of the, mid to late 60s civil rights era. That there's a lot of context that's very implicit in that show, but not made explicit. And that we imagined our users would have a need or a desire to learn more about that, to encounter more of that material. But that also users would have a need to talk about the show. At some point, somebody said, well, what would it look like if we build an exhibition website that actually had no objects from the exhibition in it, which is basically what we did. So Witness Voices is a site that's focused exclusively on a combination of user content and our own internal posts, audio files, and lots of other random and wonderful things. So we did a couple things here. One was, in focusing on user need, we wanted to make sure that our visitors had a way to talk to us or talk with us if they needed to. Now, the Blanton always has a Twitter/Instagram/Facebook hashtag associated with every show. But in this case, we actually set it up so that anytime someone uses the Witness Voices hashtag, that tweet, that image, that Tumblr post will now show up on our site. So we're basically trying to collect all of the responses to this show from wherever they may occur on the web and put them all in one place and put them sort of in a conversation with one another. And there's something sort of inherently chaotic about that. I'm not sure it works totally, but as an experiment to see whether it would work, it worked, which is fun. Also, this was something where we were also focused on our internal goals as well. So there were a couple of things, as far as making a usable site, we were testing a lot of things that we're imagining will play out in our upcoming website redesign, including, focusing on typography and readability, trying to get navigational elements out of the way when users are experiencing things, and then trying different things to see what increases retention and read times on the site. So, adding related posts, which is something that we launched with and then added later, and which seems to be increasing retention. But then also, we wanted to make sure that visitors could actually respond to the site in real time while they're in the show. So this was sort of how our agility thing played out, which is we originally started with a series of didactic labels, about 5 throughout the show, where we would ask visitors direct questions, and then there was a QR code which you could scan to write your response. Well, so after those were sitting out there, and that response would go to the Witness Voices site, sorry. After about 4 weeks, we had precisely 0 responses via those text panels. And based on studies with our visitors who, we have a lot of students, of course, who are on campus. I think it was something like 80% of the student visitors didn't have a QR code reader on their phone, and even those that did said like, I never would click that. So we nixed that idea, and then instead changed to allowing people to send responses via SMS. The idea here was to lower the technical barrier to participation as best we could. What we did not anticipate was that the signal strength inside our building is a little dicey, such that even though it tests fine when you actually try to send an SMS, only about 1 in every 4 texts you try and send actually go out there. So this was a problem too, but that said, we still did start to get some responses. So it started to become clear that if we could lower the technical hurdles enough, that people would participate. And then we finally did a test where we actually put out physical journals with pages where people could actually, with a pencil, write their responses. And we found that worked. People were doing that. And so you'll see right here, we're actually capturing some of those now. So sometimes visitors will upload their own photos of those papers, and sometimes our staff will do that if we have the permission to do so. And so, this is all about sort of an iterative process where we're able to determine kind of what works and what doesn't very quickly, and discard what doesn't work, and then build on what does. So the next big thing on the plate is a redesign of our main website. Don't go to blantonmuseum.org right now. Like a lot of museums, it's a site that we've had for between 6 and 7 years, and everybody hates it, and blah blah blah. So it's something that's been on the table for a while to redesign. And so what we see, our upcoming redesign of blantonmuseum.org is a way to actually play out these digital values in real time. So one of the first things that we're doing is making as an assumption that many startups make, like lean startups, which is that we don't actually know what our product is going to be yet. The Blanton is a bit different from some like a major New York museum where we might make an assumption that our collection is our product. And while the Blanton has very strong collections in some areas, it's not the same kind of encyclopedic collection where we might say just the existence of the collection itself provides value. So for us, we actually do have to address like what our product is. In some cases, it may be collection material, but it will also be sort of probably our approach to that material that actually has meaning and value, maybe even more than the material itself. And this is a big one, is focusing on user goals instead of functionality. And this is what I said earlier, which is we will not actually add any piece of functionality to the Blanton Museum site unless we can define it in terms of a thing that we want a user to do. And so in one of our early meetings, our director of PR and marketing said, well, we won't have to do this for like directions, the directions page, right? We're just going to have a directions page. And I said, well, no, this actually keeps us honest. So actually, yes, we are going to have to address even finding your way to the museum in terms of user goals, because those are not as consistent as we might think. A user who's a student already on the UT campus and is trying to find us via a mobile phone is a very different user from an older user who's at home and realizes that he or she just needs to get out of the house because the grandparents are home for Christmas and we need to go somewhere. And is encountering, needs to figure out how to get to the museum. So those are two very different use cases. And so for us, everything that we design on the site will be based around that. And then key is testable hypotheses. And so for us, a big part of that is saying, okay, if we define a functionality, a thing that we want a user to do, how will we verify that we are being successful with that? How will we verify that that thing is happening the way that we wanted it to, or that the user is doing the thing that we want to do? Which changes your mindset about how you build things, because it means that we'll actually be building functionality that is designed to test those hypotheses. So right now, as we're assembling our functionality list, for BlantonMuseum.org, what we're really doing is assembling a list of goals and a list of hypotheses, and then a methodology for testing those hypotheses. And then to the agility point, I'll say we're just quickly, we're using Slack. Is anybody else here using Slack? One, two, two people. So Slack is an internal communication application. And I can't say enough good things about how it has changed the way that we work. I was saying to someone earlier, they're like, oh, how is it different now that you've been using Slack? And I said, well, I don't know, because we started using this the first day that I got to the museum. So I don't know what it was like before. But it has really been interesting that it's allowed us to iterate over a lot of ideas very quickly, because we can talk quickly with one another without necessarily having to walk over and interrupt each other's workflow. So we're starting to find that we're actually having like really rich, really wonderful internal conversations via this platform. And I'm usually not one to say, hey, software is the answer to the problem you're having, but Slack is the answer to the problem that you're having. And then just one last little thing that we did last week, no, 2 weeks, last week, 2 weeks ago, sorry. Which is live streaming. Some of you may have seen this post from us. We were having a curatorial talk about Witness in the galleries. And about 4 hours before that talk, I sent a message over Slack to our content strategist, and I said, oh, hey, we should be using Meerkat to live stream that, just to see what happens. Meerkat, for those who don't know, is a live streaming app that was it's based on Twitter. It had just blown up at South by Southwest a few weeks before in Austin, so it was kind of in the air. When we started planning on how we were going to do this, we then saw a news item come over the transom that said that Twitter had launched their live streaming app called Periscope just an hour before. And we were like, what are we going to, which one should we do? Which one, and finally we were just like, we'll just do them both at the same time. So our content strategist live streamed the curatorial talk on Periscope, and I did it on Meerkat, and it was a fun time. But what this did was it very much played out our approach in the sense that because of the way the Blanton staff is structured and the way that we're able to iterate over ideas very quickly, we were able to really ramp this up just in a matter of hours and figure out what our methodology was going to be, test it quickly, and then get it ready for a live approach. So, I mean, this goes deeper than just us knowing technology, but it also goes into the skills and understanding of our staff. So when I went to Evan Garza, the curator of Witness, and I said, hey, we want to use Meerkat for your presentation today. He actually, instead of saying, hey, what's that? He said, oh, great, I've been wondering when we were going to use that, because I was at South by last week and everybody was using it and I thought it would be great. And so it was like we didn't have to have that 3-hour-long meeting where we argued about why we should or shouldn't use it. He was just like, no, let's do it. And so he was great. Like, he knew how to talk to, he was very conscious of talking to the audience that was live, but also talking to the Meerkat audience and the Periscope audience, and it was really great. And so that's demonstrative of the Blanton's approach, which is, trying to bring in as many people as we can, but also understanding that everybody has enough competency that we can do these things quickly. And so, while at a time where a lot of other museums are still imagining how they might use this, we've already done it at least once and have already posted about what we learned and what we didn't learn. So, this is another aspect of what we're doing that I haven't really talked about, which is, we feel that our experimentation should help everyone else in the museum community as well. I think, last thing, okay. How am I doing on time? I can't read my stopwatch. Am I good? Okay. So then the last thing that we're going to be doing over the next few months is trying to assess how we measure impact and then how we measure growth in that impact over time. And this is really critical because for me, one of the reasons that the Blanton's current site is, something that everyone at the museum can't stand is partially because it was something that, like most museum websites, it was built and then everybody said, great, it's done, awesome, and then kind of walked away, with some exceptions. And so for us, I want to make sure that we have a way of measuring whether the website is doing what we want it to do, but then also saying, now we want to increase that impact over time so that everybody stays engaged and stays focused on what it's doing. So we're actually looking at a way to measure what that would be. And this is kind of like our initial kind of back of the envelope computation, which is saying that we'll actually can determine value by basically saying, looking at an impact measurement and basically dividing it by the amount of effort that goes into creating it. And what I think is potentially valuable about this is when we look at increasing the value of what we do, we can look at both parts, where we can say, something that is not as high of an impact, but that only took us 5 minutes to produce, might have just as high of a value as something that took us a really long time to produce that has a significantly higher impact. So this will be something that we'll be working on ways to assess over time, and don't ask me questions about this because I actually have no idea how we're gonna turn this into real numbers yet. I'm hoping to find a statistician that works at the university that I might be able to lean on to figure this out for me. But that's kind of the approach. So what we're hoping is that'll allow us to kind of stay focused and grow over time and increase our impact as we go. Okay, thanks everybody. That's it. Do we want to do questions now, or okay? All right. I didn't see if there were any Twitter questions or not. So.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. You had some really great words up there: need, agility, practice. You didn't have the word content up there, and you didn't talk much about the role of the curator in all of this. And I'd like to hear what role the curator has, how he or she or they are integrated into the digital team, and content, because the content, of course, usually or more traditionally comes from the curatorial side. So.
Sure. So once again, I should emphasize we're not building a digital team. So in a nutshell, what our approach is saying, instead of building a digital team, the idea is to turn the entire museum into that digital team. So increasing the competence of every member of staff. That said, content is obviously critical. And in terms of measuring value and impact, almost inevitably content is going to be the key part of that. That said, I wouldn't say we necessarily see curators as the sole source of that content for the museum. And they're the most important source, but we have a significant, very active education department. Our social media efforts have already been well established for a long time, so there's a lot of value there. And like with the Walker Art Museum, some of the value might be in not even us generating content as much as saying sometimes, here's our take on stuff that's already out there, and pointing you to other things. And that would be very much a part of the kind of agility program. So, in thinking about digital values, part of the reason that content isn't at the center of that is that these digital values are really focused on the sort of transformational aspect of the program that we do. And content is forever. And so and I'm doing a terrible job of answering your question. But content is something that we just sort of see as being our job, like everyone's job in a way. So it's not something that we're addressing specifically. Now, having said that, one of the big things that we're doing on the website redesign team is it's a cross-disciplinary team. We have educators, we have curators, we have me, we've got people from visitor services, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things that we do week to week is each person on the team has to write a blog post, just for just internally, so only other people on the team can see it. And then each week, the team, we basically do a kind of a design critique effectively on that blog post. And so part of the reasoning behind that is that we can help to sort of determine, even though we'll have lots of individual voices within the museum, what the parameters of sort of the institutional fence around those voices look like. and then also to help those who might not be used to writing for the web understand better how to do that, and that we can all help each other do that. And so we just got done with our first design critique, which was a post that I had written, because I said, okay, if I'm going to make everybody else do this, I have to go through the ringer first. And it was great. It was, it was harsh, frankly. People were like, well, there's some grammar problems in there that you need to address, and I have to question whether the sort of sarcastic tone that you're taking in this post is really appropriate for us. And so we had a long conversation about that. So I'm sort of dancing around your question a little bit, but hopefully that gets a little closer.
Did you start at the Blanton after the initiative to get everybody's competency level up higher, or were you part of the campaigning to bring everybody's?
Both, yeah. So I was freelance for a while, and so I contracted with the Blanton for about 7 months, and that was when we developed kind of the parameters of what this program would look like. But the effort to really start actually increasing that competency didn't start until I was on staff.
And what was that initiative like?
Well, it's still ongoing, and we're still figuring it out. As technology comes out, sometimes we suddenly have to change and okay, now more people need to know how to do Twitter than not. But so yeah, some of that comes from simple things, like I said, like getting our staff so that they know how to write better for the web. Everybody on the website development team has to have a Twitter account and know how that works. Like I said, the 10-minute tech is something that we're going to start doing in the next few weeks. I do office hours every week where anybody can come in and kind of ask questions that they've got. But then there's a much longer, sort of more formal program to increase very specific competencies. And that is planned out but hasn't yet started. And that actually has tiers of competencies from the sort of first tier of competency is just learning how to format links for blog posts, and learning how to work with a CMS, up to a higher tier, the top tier, which is how to read Google Analytics, how to format a JSON file, that kind of thing. And so that program hasn't started yet, but that'll be much more formal. That'll be classes that we'll actually hold at the museum.
So what things are people not doing because now they're doing this? I mean, it's a trade-off. I mean, I'm certain were only working 6 hours a day prior to your arrival, and so now they're doing this. I mean, what is the museum trading off? And that doesn't have to be a negative, it can be, but you're doing different things when you're writing a blog post than, I don't know, going to a meeting about X, Y, or Z. Or do you have a sense of that?
I'll be honest, I don't buy that question. I mean, I'm not to be dismissive, but I just, it's something where, for me, it's a matter of optimizing the time that goes into things, much more so than it is saying, here, we're adding something new onto what you already do. For instance, it's okay, if a curator is already writing a long essay for an exhibition, it's for us saying, okay, how can we now just excerpt that for a blog post, as opposed to saying, okay, now we have to have a blog post.
No, fair enough, but the reason I raised the question is that is the conventional way most museum managers will frame this. And so in order to introduce these ideas, you have to be able to argue effectively that a response to that.
Sure.
And so, I mean, I take your point about disagreeing with the frame, but the question is real.
And I mean, I'll point to my director, who is frankly fantastic, and who, when we were developing this program, very much understood that if the Blanton is going to be successful in the digital space, that this was the approach we had to take. We weren't going to build a digital team that was going to do all this stuff. Just the resources were not there to do that. So for her, there's very much a clear understanding that it's like, this is a part of what we do. And so, and some of that just is that Blanton has a fantastic office culture that's very deliberately arrived at, where, and part of the reason, I guess it's not fair to say I don't buy that question, but part of the reason it's sort of not an issue at the Blanton is just because the staff works so seamlessly and cross-disciplinary ways that it just is so rarely an issue. It's like if I know that I'm adding an unacceptable amount of burden onto somebody, I don't even make the request. So
I guess
that's why I'm sort of struggling with answering the question.
No, I'm
very
trying
well.
to translate that into other settings,
Mm-hmm.
say my own. How to, I'm looking for vocabulary to frame
fair
that
enough.
conversation.
Okay.
That then it becomes a real discussion and a desire as opposed to an antagonistic
Like
debate.
I've already
I don't
got
want
too
to
much
debate.
work to do as it is.
Yeah, I
and
don't
now
want to
you
debate.
also want me to
Yeah.
make a podcast. Like
Right.
what? Yeah. I might be a little too tired and stayed out too late doing karaoke last night to come up with good vocabulary for it right now. But maybe let me think on that, and let's come back to that in the panel this afternoon, and let me give it some thought.
I mean, I'm not gonna ask a question. Since I convened, I can do this. I mean, I think there's a real danger, and I've seen this in my wife's industry in journalism, and you can see this in the digital humanities and academics, is that there's this is new and good, and people are going to learn it, but there's a lot of labor and a lot of training, and that stuff does get lost. And I think that's I think it's nice to say, like we seamlessly have a team, but hours are hours. And so I think that it's a dangerous thing to be considering. And particularly because the social media are free, fast, and easy, institutions don't see them as much as a kind of a financial and a kind of labor kind of thing. Oh, we're just blog posting or we're just tweeting. It's like, well, you can tweet real poorly and it takes a lot of you can tweet real poorly. And so that's the, we have these conversations here, like, what am I asking the faculty to do and how does the lab support them? And there's this tension between, not hiring a digital media team, but then if you want a certain level of proficiency, you need people who are trained in that. And if you have built-in people who don't have the training, how do you negotiate all that? So I think your stuff is great, but it's hard. It's very careful. You have to be careful with the language, I think, and I think that's Deborah's point, especially as you kind of introduce institutional change. So there's some questions in the back there.
I think Jonathan raised his hand like ages ago.
Yeah.
So when you were doing the live streaming, and 3 hours later, it went from like an idea on Slack to, oh yeah, we can do this. Did you go through like that process of, all right, what's our hypothesis? Why are we doing this? Or was it solo effort that you said you have to be rigorous, you have to be honest, you have to, yes, we're going to look at our directions page again, even though it's assumed to be untouchable. Did you do that for that too?
That's totally a fair question, and kind of is the answer. This was a case where we were moving pretty fast, and our clear goal was to test the technology. But that said, what was interesting about doing that testing kind of in real time was that user need emerged as a result of doing that. So in going into it, we just sort of said, we'll live stream the talk and see what happens. And what happened was users did things that we did not expect them to do. Like on the Meerkat stream, I had users saying, hey, can you like close in on that detail, or can you pan over this painting because I can't see it, or hey, what, is that painting canvas? I think was a question that we got. And frankly, I was not expecting that I was going to be sort of like remote hands for people watching it at home, and that was totally what happened. And so, now, as we start to think about if we, and we almost certainly will, develop this into a regular ongoing program, now we know that those are real needs that exist that we need to address. So like for, if you read the post on what we did, one of the things that I found was like I had users asking me to do stuff, but because we were there with a real tour with real people in person, you know, I had to like kind of wait until everybody had moved past the work that we were talking about before I could like do a close-up or whatever, because I couldn't get in front of people. So now we know, like, okay, if we're going to live stream a curatorial talk like that in the gallery in the future, we'll almost certainly do it without a real live tour going on. It'll just be for live streaming. We'll probably do it when the museum is closed so we can control for sound, and we'll know that, you know, when visitors say, hey, can you do a close-up of that painting, we can just do it right there, and we can talk to them live in real time. So, you know, now as we start to turn this into more of a programmatic thing rather than just a one-off experiment, now the testing methodology comes into play much more aggressively. There.
Hey, Koven. It's great hearing all of the ways you guys have been approaching taking on this new approach. Can you say some of the resistance you guys have encountered, whether internal or external, and how you've addressed it?
There's been very little internal resistance, but again, I just got there in mid-November, you know, so like let's talk again in a year, and we'll see. It's like how that actually plays out in the real world. But you know, right now I have the advantage of, you know, the staff at the Blanton kind of knew that they needed a digital / tech / future person. For years before I was actually brought on board. So right now I'm very much in a great honeymoon phase where everybody's just like, oh my God, we're so glad that you're here, and it's great that, you know, we're addressing these things. So there hasn't been a lot of internal resistance. But what I will say is I think it's not so much resistance as much as not always a real clarity internally about the approach that we're taking, because I think for some people it was like, oh, we're bringing in a digital guy, that means we're going to have like flashy in-gallery interactives and, you know, that sort of thing. And you know, that's not necessarily what we're doing. If a real need for those that we can identify arises, like we'll do them. But you know, so it's, you know, I think the approach we're taking is just slightly to the left of what what maybe some of the staff were expecting, but I haven't noticed a lot of internal resistance to it yet. I think you've been waiting for a long time.
This was a really interesting talk because often with digital, you know, programs and museums, you hear the question, so who is this for? And you sort of then hear that word, the audience. And then I haven't really heard a lot of, or the visitor, but I haven't heard a lot of talk about, you know, Blanton serves the students or a faculty, or, you know, we get a lot of sort of general public from our traveling shows. Are you figuring out who your audience is at the same time that you're doing digital initiatives? Or is that part of, is that something for marketing and branding? And
no, I mean, those efforts do exist in the PR and marketing area. But a big part of the, you know, the research approach and, you know, the testable hypotheses is that we are attempting to actually figure out who our audience is. I mean, we sort of know in a very general way, you know, I mean, certainly our web audience, we know what that traffic looks like, at least in terms of geography. We know that, you know, a big, huge chunk of it are people from Austin, and then a big chunk of that are students. You know, but that doesn't really tell us a lot about behavior. And so part of, you know, creating things like the Witness Voices site is to start to see like what kinds of behavior will people do, you know, when we put this type of stuff out there. And then, you know, are there things that we can then do that may alter that behavior or increase the likelihood that that behavior will occur? So we're not identifying necessarily audiences in the traditional, you know, demographic way, but we're looking sort of almost like an implicit psychographic profile where we can say, you know, here, based on things that we've built and the way that people have interacted with them, we kind of know that this is a semi-discrete audience that has these characteristics and that we can do these things with. Sorry.
Yeah, you've kind of hinted at this a few times, but I'm curious about the dynamics or the tension between your in-person, actual physical audience in the space and how you think about working with your audience member when they're in the flesh in the museum and the digital audience out there wherever they are. And whether those things, whether it becomes a conflict or not to sort of prioritize who you're programming for. I mean, in some ways I've noticed in museums that a digital audience and a digital platform makes sense. It's a natural coming together of people who think are looking for a certain kind of thing in a certain space. But a digital interface in an actual environment, as you mentioned with the QR code example, is sometimes not an automatic fit. So like I went to a museum recently just as a visitor, and I noticed people had iPads hanging around their necks because the interface was no longer an audio but on a smaller thing, and because it had a lanyard on it, they were walking around with this device on it, and I thought, well, this can't be the answer to where. So just, whether it can be more natural and seamless, I think, if you're thinking digitally to work digitally, but what about in the actual and the physical, and how do you prioritize this?
The sort of in-gallery piece is like sort of the furthest horizon for us right now, So I'll be honest, it's the part that we've addressed the least to this point. But in that sense, we are kind of not working from an assumption that there will be digital things in the gallery. And I think that's actually a healthy assumption to make, because then, when you arrive at a point where you say, there's really no other way to deliver the material that we think the visitor needs here than some sort of digital interface, I think it helps to focus you better on what that interface should be. Obviously that's totally abstract, and we have, we haven't done that in practice. But, we would approach that in the same way that we're approaching everything else, which is we do little low effort tests first to see what people really do. And then from that, try and extrapolate a bigger program where we might say, is this worth spending more resources on or not? Because a big question for us is always sustainability. Like, if we go out and get grant funding for a big digital thing, like, I need to know that it's going to really, really work before we do it. And I need to know that we're going to be able to keep it going once the grant money runs out. And so, we're going to always do research and testing before we even address that. And once again, I danced around your question without really answering it. Sorry.
No, you answered.
Okay.
So I have one.
All right, I've made everybody mad, so we can go.
I have one last question. So in your introduction, we went through those big institutions, and the Indianapolis and Denver and the Met, which all have varying ranges of immersion in this.
Yeah.
That are very responsive to the type of institution they are historically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know you worked at the Met, and now you're working in Blanton, which is a smaller university museum. And I was wondering if you can reflect a little bit on your paths through those kinds of spaces and what you're able to do at the Blanton, and whether you would have been able to do it at other places. And because you have an interesting history of institutions that tell a story about a lot of how museums are trying to deal with this. And if you could just reflect a little bit on that.
Well, I think the big difference between the Blanton and other institutions I've worked at is that I was sort of brought in there before they kind of decided what position they needed to fill, and that's when I contracted with them for a while, and that makes a big difference because at the IMA, at the Met, and at Denver, those positions were very much already like defined, and we knew where in the org chart they sat, and and so I think this is often true for digital people working in museums. Your ability to pull things off is somewhat constrained by what part of the org chart you sit in. And so, the difference with the Blanton was that, we were able to say what should this position be and where should this position be in order for it to be effective in the way that we need it to be. And so, relative to other institutions, I feel like I don't have to manage up a lot. And that's a big difference. You know, and that's not to say that those institutions were poor or whatever. It was just that, you know, like they had more of a tradition of technology than the Blanton did, and so they kind of knew what they wanted out of that technology person. And so, yeah, that's the biggest difference. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sir? Yeah, whatever. Sorry.
Were you working at a startup?
Yeah, effectively. Yeah.
But you don't charge entrance?
Not for students, faculty, and staff of the university.
For everybody else, because that would be one of the differences with regard to the MIT, for example, which seems to charge entrance from everybody.
No, the MIT community is free.
But everybody else is paying.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's been interesting. We had these two yesterday and today stories of university museums, and I mean now Jennifer will speak about Cleveland and like how there's different possibilities and size and scale. So thank you, Koven.
Thanks, everybody.